Good evening, everyone. It is marvellous to see so many of you here. This isn't one of the formal speeches. It's actually just to say we will start our evening with what's going to be a really exciting experience of dance and music. Thanks to Sampad Arts, we're going to see dance artist Vidya Patel and skilled multi-instrumentalist Shami Pitya performing Converse.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the University of Birmingham, and I think that was a splendid performance celebrating Indian culture and dance, and of course Diwali. This is the time of celebration. I'm delighted to welcome you to the University of Birmingham, the first India Institute inaugural distinguished guest lecture. The India Institute is an idea that we've had for some time, and ideas are one thing, putting them into action is another thing. And earlier this year, we launched the India Institute thanks to Professor Robin Mason. Thank you for all that you've done to help make this happen. And it was launched with the Indian High Commissioner Yash Sinha, a very close friend of mine. Our families go back a long way. His father was a general in the Indian Army. My father was. They were both army commanders, both from the 5th Gurkha Regiment, both headed the Gurkhas in India, and we're great friends. And he came and inaugurated the India Institute this year. And for me, it's particularly special because I'm proud to be the first Indian-born Chancellor for Russell Group University in Great Britain. And to have an institute here is very, very special. This lecture is jointly organized, not only by the university's India Institute, but also the Consul General of India, based here in Birmingham. And we've established a very close and productive relationship with the Indian High Commission and the Consul General. And we worked very closely well before the India Institute was formed, and now it's taken things to another level. And I would like to pay tribute to the Consul General Dr Aman Puri, who's over here, for all that he's done to help the India Institute in its formation, and also what he's done to help organize today's lecture in inviting our guest lecturer. So thank you, Dr Aman Puri. This joint guest lecture aims to encourage more debate on major social, cultural and policy issues that relate to both the UK and India, and it will become an annual event on the campus in future. It's of course particularly pertinent to note that we've had alumni from Birmingham University, from India, going back to the very start of this university over a century ago, including my own grandfather, who was an undergraduate here and graduated in 1931. And he learned how to fly when he was here and joined the Royal Indian Air Force and served right until the end of the war and retired as a squadron leader. And of course that's particularly pertinent as this is the 100th anniversary of the formation of the Royal Air Force. Of course, we're commemorating the end of the First World War this year as well, in which over a million volunteers from India served in the First World War. Without their service... the microphone seems to have gone off. Can you... Oh, it's back on. Without their service and sacrifice, the result of the war would have been very different, and we'll always be grateful to those from India, the volunteers who served, and those who made the ultimate sacrifice in the First World War. The India Institute has a supportive network of academics, research councils, institutions, government offices, commercial partners, and all those interested in building partnerships with India. It was created for forging new connections between Birmingham and India, empowering the best minds to address global challenges and be the focal point of the Birmingham-India relationship. Of course, there's a large diaspora from India based here in Birmingham. Since the launch in January this year, the university has been widening and deepening our engagement with India. I'm delighted to see that through this new platform, the university has been significantly increasing its visibility and influence, from supporting the women's cancer studies in Punjab, facilitating collaboration with key partners such as the Indian Institute of Technology, IIT Delhi, and the IITs are some of the most difficult institutions to get into. 1.5 million Indian youngsters, school leavers, apply every year to get into the IITs, and in total there are less than 10,000 places. We also work with the IIT Bombay on air pollution issues. We work with the Sports Authority of India to support the development of sports policy and education throughout India. We're making a real difference and a bigger impact. And this, again, builds on our long and close-standing historical connections. We are natural partners with India with shared values and ambitions. Earlier this year, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Prime Minister Theresa May agreed to establish a new India-UK tech partnership to boost the collaboration between the two countries. And the work we're doing with India, for example, recently we had the Chief Minister of Haryana, a state in India, where, wearing my business hat of Cobra Beer with our partners Molson Coors, we have a brewery in Haryana and in Punjab. We're working with the Haryana state government to establish a sustainable clean cooling chain in India. It fits in very well with the top business agenda for both governments and will create massive opportunities for UK enterprises and bring enormous economic and social benefits to India. And within the background of Brexit, it's paramount for British universities, which are the best in the world along with the United States of America, to build strategic global links. And so we're very fortunate at Birmingham to have this strong partnership with India well in advance of any potential repositioning of the UK next year. And it gives me immense pleasure to have Ambassador Dr Jaishankar here with us to share with us his views on what India means to the West. I was the founding chairman of the UK-India Business Council and was fortunate to work very closely with India, and I also sat on the Prime Minister of India's Global Advisory Council when Dr Manmohan Singh was Prime Minister. And I remember at the meetings of the Prime Minister of India's Global Advisory Council, he would have only a handful of select cabinet ministers present, but always on his right-hand side would be India's Foreign Secretary. So you have somebody here who's been at the heart of government and will give you a real insight into what goes on within India. And also as a Zoroastrian Parsi, it gives me great pride that he is now working with the Tata Group, a company that we're all very proud of in India, and of course that owns Jaguar Land Rover over here at our doorstep. So I conclude by welcoming you again, and really the most important objective of this university is down to one thing, and is knowledge and learning. And my younger son said to me the other day, he said, "Dad, you've got to live as if you're going to die tomorrow, and you've got to learn as if you're going to live forever. And that was a saying by Mahatma Gandhi, and I know this evening we will all learn a great deal. Welcome and thank you.
Well, following Lord Bilimoria's welcome, I am very pleased and very honoured to be able to introduce you this evening to our distinguished lecturer, Ambassador Dr S Jaishankar. The Ambassador grew up in New Delhi in a distinguished family. His late father, K. Subramaniam, was a man of intellectual brilliance and global vision, the acknowledged father of strategic thinking in India, and considered the modern Chanakya. His mother received a PhD in music from Delhi University, and his two brothers would go on to become permanent secretary to the Indian government and a noted historian, respectively. He graduated from St. Stephen's College at the University of Delhi, then studied for an MA in political science and an MPhil and PhD in international relations from Jawaharlal Nehru University, where he specialized in nuclear diplomacy. Joining the Indian Foreign Service in 1977, Ambassador Jaishankar served as third secretary and second secretary in the Indian mission to the Soviet Union in Moscow from 1979 to 1981, during which time he studied Russian. On returning to New Delhi, he worked as a special assistant to the diplomat G. Partha Sarati and as Under-Secretary in the Americas Division of India's Ministry of External Affairs, dealing with the United States. He then went on from 1985 to 1988 to be First Secretary at the Indian Embassy in Washington, D.C. From 1988 to 1990, he served in Sri Lanka as First Secretary, and then from 1990 to 93 as Councillor Commercial at the Indian Mission in Budapest. Returning once again to New Delhi, he served as Director East Europe in the Ministry of External Affairs and as Press Secretary and Speechwriter for President of India, Shankar Dayal Sharma. He was then Deputy Chief of Mission at the Indian Embassy in Tokyo from 1996 to 2000. And then in 2000, he was appointed India's ambassador to the Czech Republic. From 2004 to 2007, he was Joint Secretary Americas at the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi. And in this capacity, he was closely involved in negotiating the US-India Civil Nuclear Agreement and improving defense cooperation, amongst many other major initiatives. From 2007 to 2009, Ambassador Jaishankar served as India's High Commissioner to Singapore, and then became India's longest-serving ambassador to China with a 4.5-year term. His tenure coincided with several major developments in relations between India and China. He was then appointed as India's ambassador to the United States in September 2013, and last, and by no means least, as Foreign Secretary of India on the 29th of January 2015, serving until January of this year, so becoming India's longest-serving Foreign Secretary in 4 decades. He's credited with shaping the robust yet nimble current foreign policy of India, enhancing its status as a world power. He's now President, Global Corporate Affairs of Tata Group, responsible for the group's global corporate affairs and international strategy development. Now, I've taken some time carefully describing Ambassador Jaishankar's career to make clear, as if you didn't know already, that there are few, if any, individuals who have such a range of knowledge and experience of so many aspects and parts of the world. The US and Europe, to China, Japan, and Southeast Asia. I suspect there are very few indeed who can speak Russian, English, Tamil, Hindi, conversational Japanese, and it's a pleasure to be joined this evening by Kyoko, the ambassador's wife, and a bit of Hungarian. For those fortunate enough to have already read his writings and speeches, you cannot help be struck by his insights and his wisdom. He combines sharp analysis with tremendous political and strategic intuition. In his many and varied roles, he has commanded uniform respect in a way that very few others have done. Helped, no doubt, not just by his wisdom, but also by his wicked sense of humour. He's truly carrying on his father's legacy as one of India's foremost and distinguished thinkers about geopolitics. I know that this evening's lecture will, in keeping with all his other speeches, be delightful, intelligent, and stimulating. So it's with great pleasure that I now invite Ambassador Dr S Jaishankar to come to the stage to tell us what India means to the West. Ambassador.
Good evening, Lord Bilimoria, Professor Robin Mason, Consul General Dr Aman Puri, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a great honor to be invited to deliver the first India Institute Distinguished Lecture. And I must say it's my first visit to Birmingham, and I wish I'd come sooner. But I'm really delighted to actually be here in a part of the United Kingdom with which India's relations and my business group's relations are particularly strong. Had I been speaking in India, I would have actually done it exactly the other way around, which is to say, what does the West mean to India? But since I'm not, I'm actually pretty much going to say the same thing, but give it a logic which I hope would appeal to you. And I do that at a time when actually the world's going in ways that most of us didn't see coming. People are really perplexed about what's happening around us. And I think at such a time to lay out some strategic logic to the West and to India clearly could be helpful. So let me share with you my thoughts about what India means to the West. And I begin with an observation of Winston Churchill, very typical, made about 8 decades ago, where he said that India is no more a single country than the equator. Now, around the same time, when asked by a reporter what he thought of Western civilization, Mahatma Gandhi replied that he actually thought it would be a very good idea. Now, since India's independence, the West and India have largely put history behind them to forge a very comfortable relationship. There's little of the historical grudges that characterize, for example, China's relations with the West. And this is despite the fact that a rising India is very much at the heart of a changing world order, while the West is very much the entrenched one. Now, the West has been, for India, a mixed blessing till recently, helpful on development, but less so on global positioning. But as I said, the world is changing as we speak, and new equilibriums and calculations will need new understandings. As the world is being rearranged, the West and India could revisit the old order to mutual advantage. And there are very powerful arguments why they should do so, taking into account not just the obstacles of the past, but actually place bets on the possibilities of the future. Now, as a policy proposition, it stands to reason that India and the West would have very strong convergences. After all, there is much that they share, including a liberal democratic political model, similar governance practices, a credible market economy, and sustained commitment to the rule of law. That India, after independence, chose to continue its close ties with the English-speaking world was both a political and a cultural decision of some consequence. Over the years thereafter, a very substantive relationship that covered politics, security, trade, investment, services, education, and development assistance was built up with key Western nations, especially the United Kingdom and the United States. This was characterized by extensive contacts at the people-to-people level, as well as between civil societies and institutions. The growing Indian origin diaspora in many Western countries strengthened the bonding with India. And at challenging moments in India's contemporary history, support from Western countries, economic support and military support, made the critical difference. This was particularly the case in the 1960s after India's border conflict with China and during the years of famine, which pretty much covered the 1960s. India was the largest recipient of development assistance from Western nations and from the multilateral banks that they control and influence. Now, as India embarked on reforms 25 years ago and shifted to higher growth rates, Western countries were very strongly supportive of this trajectory. They also facilitated India's political rise thereafter in the international system, including through the 2005 India-US nuclear deal. I had the privilege of being associated with that, and with memberships of various export control regimes. On the major international issues of the day, such as terrorism, maritime security, or connectivity, there is now a considerable meeting of minds between India and the West. This relationship has made itself felt in global affairs, especially after 9/11, and the European Union, including the United Kingdom and the US, are among the top economic partners and are central to India for accessing capital, technology, and best practices that are so necessary for our continuing modernization. Now, this maturing of ties is also reflected in two-way flows with Indian companies, such as ours, now emerging as major foreign investors in Western economies. The politics of these ties has kept pace with other sectors, while the India-US relationship in particular has flowered. The third option that Europe has long represented on strategic issues is not insignificant for India. These accumulated developments have today created a high degree of comfort between India and the West, and in many ways, India could be considered the most Western society of Asia. Now, while appreciating where we have reached today, it must also be acknowledged that this was not always the state of our ties. This helps us identify some of the challenges to its continued growth, and an honest analysis probably would start with the partition of the Indian subcontinent that diminished India's influence in the immediate and extended neighborhood. It also skewed the larger Asian balance of power to India's disadvantage, and an artificial twinning of India and Pakistan was created that was broken only in 1971. There were also for many years interest in politically exploiting fissures within Indian society, and the latitude extended even today to separatist activities citing democratic freedoms is troubling. Now, in terms of policy choices, Western association in our neighborhood till a few years ago was often with political forces that kept a distance from India. And if India's democratic values are recognized today, I should say that was not always the case. On the contrary, military regimes in the subcontinent were often held out as examples of efficiency in the past. And for many years, the broad Western approach was to keep India at play and yet also keep it in check. In truth, it was a Goldilocks approach to the Indian porridge, not too hot, not too cold, needing some effort to get it just right. Now, some of these differences will continue, and among them, would be issues pertaining to the development divide, where around range of economic and social issues, Indian interests and positions are quite divergent from those of the West. Many of these involve sensitive areas where livelihood of millions is at stake, and clearly there is going to be a divergence of approach between India and the West in areas like trade, climate change, and intellectual property. Obviously, each party will try and frame issues to its advantage. But I think the second issue probably merits more attention today, and that is in the world of security and politics. India has often suffered collateral damage to Western initiatives, and a case in point was the Afghanistan jihad in the 1980s that went on to fuel terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir. Developments in Afghanistan and the Middle East remain of concern even today. And while perceptions and priorities differ significantly, we have to accept that our vantage point is not the same. Now, on critical issues like nuclear proliferation, again, the Western focus has been very much more on Iran, on North Korea, while for India, actually, it is the whitewashing of Pakistan and the fairy tale of a private network of A.Q. Khan that has been a source of concern. Now, today, it is not just India's capabilities that are growing, but also the relative position of the West that is changing. The West has lost its edge in the last decades with two strategic miscalculations. The first was the neglect of the threat from fundamentalist political Islam after having successfully used it to undermine the Soviet Union. It was magnified by an unnecessary war in Iraq and an incompetent one in Afghanistan. And while much has been written on Iraq, it is only recently that there's been a grudging recognition that on Afghanistan, the West has been confusing the problem, Pakistan, for the solution. The second was an underestimation of China, having built it up as a counterweight to the Soviet Union. It is truly hard to find in history a similar example of facilitating the rapid rise of a strategic adversary, ignoring so many warning signals. The expectation that a prosperous China would adjust to the world rather than seek to shape it was a monumental act of complacency. Now, India may be a rising power, but it still has a great distance to go. It can do so in an autarkic manner or by leveraging international opportunities more aggressively. This is a cost-benefit analysis that its policymakers will constantly make, and there are lessons even from contemporary history that it needs to take into account. The fact is that the most impressive growth stories in the world over the last 150 years have all been with the encouragement of the West. It goes without saying that the West would have its own agenda, but for the recipient of the support, the question is to utilize the option and handle its consequences. The future course of our ties, therefore, is very much a mix of intersecting interests, strategic calculations, and diplomatic confidence. Now, what India stands to gain from this relationship is fairly obvious. A strong partnership with the West will lead to considerable political benefits and economic gains, though both of them would be balanced by Indian equities in competing constituencies. But looking just beyond the horizon, there are immense opportunities to be exploited in terms of technology applications and human resources optimization. Globalization may currently be under stress due to some distortions, but its long-term viability is difficult to challenge. While it can be asserted with some confidence that a combination of economics, technology, and demographics will all draw India and the West closer, the real difference would probably be made by politics and values. For it to succeed in large measure, India must fit into the larger Western scheme. The rise of China and a flatter global power structure mandates that any sensible planning would base itself on a multipolar architecture. That would, as noted earlier, capture not only the growing political pluralism, but also the diversity within the Western camp. For the world, it is imperative that Asia develops its own multipolarity in a vigorous manner. That it can do best if India steps up to the plate fully. Envisaging India's growth as a strategic development in larger Western interest is a starting point. Such thinking has become more accepted in the United States and in Japan. It still has to develop more in Europe. From an economic perspective, it would also be in Western interest that India emerge more rapidly as a source of greater global demand and supply, thereby reducing excessive dependence on any single geography. This is going to be particularly important as we move to a world of greater technology dependence. Given that resource and cost optimization will remain guiding principles of business, the salience of India's manpower to the global economy will only grow with time. Its market economy and responsible politics makes it a safer partner when it comes to activities like contract designing and manufacturing. India is a society that the West can be comfortable with in terms of its assumptions and expectations. But there are also larger political principles to prove by ensuring India's success. It will affirm that democratic politics and high growth economics are not mutually exclusive, and establish that democratic values are global, not just Western. India's multi-faith society is an enormous statement of global social stability. If you stop and think about it, it is India today that acts as a firewall, preventing the spread of fundamentalism and radicalism from the geographies to its west to those to its east. But it also has activist aspects that would be of growing value to the Western world. In areas like maritime security in the Indian Ocean or building connectivity in Asia, its contribution can make a difference. A willingness to shoulder greater responsibilities is already visible in India's efforts at extending humanitarian assistance and disaster response. And we have seen that in the last few years during the earthquake in Nepal, during the fighting in Yemen, and in a number of situations in the Indian Ocean. Its participation strengthens export control regimes dealing with sensitive technologies, and its presence not only adds to the credibility of various global initiatives and negotiations, but as we saw in Paris during the climate change negotiations, can help to find an outcome. By 2024, just 6 years from now, India would be the most populous country in the world. And by 2035, the third largest economy, even in nominal terms. With a stronger commitment to modernization and by adopting leapfrogging strategies in many sectors, it will hold a greater attraction even on its own, but will have a greater say in the world. For a global system that must reinvent itself to stay relevant, India is a good refresh button to press. For all this to work, a number of important relationships have to come together in a self-supporting manner. These include India's ties with the United Kingdom, with the United States, with Europe, and with Japan. The state of the world currently puts perhaps a greater value on working with the United States than it did earlier. And here, actually, I have some good news to share with you. At a time when the rest of the world is struggling with a deliberately unpredictable Trump administration, India has actually further solidified its ties with the US. It is to India's advantage that an American president is less a prisoner of regimes and orthodoxies that have long blocked progress. In the Trump vision of the world, allies have disappointed America and adversaries have cheated it. India is fortunate in being neither. There is consequently a willingness to explore building on this convergence, and the two countries today have developed stakes in each other's standing. A more focused, realistic, and result-oriented United States working abroad is a welcome change. To a degree, that's now happening in Afghanistan, but maintaining the strategic balance in the Indo-Pacific is another important priority. If there are divergences that need to be reconciled, these are likely to be in the domain of trade, on Russia, and on Iran. But the bottom line is that in an era of deal-making, a solid relationship is not only of value in itself, but strengthens the hands of both countries as they negotiate with the rest of the world. The advent of President Trump has had an unintended impact on major global relationships. China, for example, is reaching out much more to its neighbors in 2018 than it did in 2016. One player whose behavior has seen perceptible change is the European Union, including its bigger states. Already facing difficulties with Russia, Europe sees a weakening of the American commitment that has long been the bedrock of its policies. This is quite apart from heightened trade friction and political differences on the rise of right-wing politics. It also has to cope with China, which is now making inroads through mechanisms like the 16+1 summit. Even in the last year, there is a visible realization in Europe that its agnosticism on Asia has not served it well. This happens to coincide at a time when India, quite independently, is reaching out to Europe. The European Union is India's largest trade partner and key source of investments and technology. The relationship has a potential to grow even in the short term, especially when linked to India's modernization initiatives. Hopefully, that would encourage both sides to put more energy into the shared goal of deepening it. But there is also a security dimension that often tends to get overlooked. In the past, France, Germany, and UK have all served as independent avenues of defense sourcing for India. Today, that could be the basis for larger industrial collaboration. It's also worth noting that the European presence in the Indian Ocean is not inconsequential, nor indeed its influence to regions to India's immediate west. The United Kingdom has always had a special place in India's engagement with the West. While much of that derives from our shared history, the modern phase of our ties has been very substantive. Whether it is the GLR production that Lord Bilimoria just reminded us of, I hardly need to underline that economic ties today bind us very closely. This country has served India not just as a gateway to Europe, but to much of the world. The choices that it would now make on its own future will obviously have repercussions for India as well. There is a solid foundation of exchanges and cooperation that has been built in other walks of life, especially in education and in science and technology. The bridge provided by the Indian diaspora in the UK has a unique value. When it comes to global affairs, there is a tradition of close consultation that is now recognizing more common concerns. We are both key members of the Commonwealth, and together it is our weight that could help shape the directions of its future. Now, while the world is indeed very different, its fundamentals have not been completely overturned. It's certainly true that Asia has risen impressively and the West has yielded space economically and politically. But to suggest that Asian GDPs would translate themselves quickly into strategic influence is erroneous. Such economic determinism may be an effective motivational exercise, but really cannot be the basis for policymaking. The fact is that right now, the major markets are still in the West, as in fact is the capital needed for growth. More importantly, the West continues to be the main source of technology and innovation, even if its leads are eroding. Global institutions are anchored in its mores and standards are largely set there. The global commons are largely regulated by the West, and its invisible influence is perhaps even more potent than its visible form. So declaration of the impending demise of the West are premature, to say the least. the military balance in the world actually brings this reality out very sharply. The defense budgets of the world are heavily dominated by Western expenditure, even if one were to leave out the United States. And consider the wars fought in the last 25 years. Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. Whether it's the cause or the result, all of them have seen a Western will to use force, sharp improvements in technology and its applications, and an ability to apply political pressure. The United States and Europe still remain the leading suppliers of military and dual-use technologies, and large parts of the world have a Western presence in some form. And at the end of the day, the West still is the early responder in global crisis. So when making a case for close collaboration with the West, there are understandably arguments of caution in India that reflect our difficult history. Recent developments like Iraq and Afghanistan are factors, as indeed are memories of Western actions in the past in our neighborhood. But the fact is that India is rising in a structurally loose world, and this is increasingly a legacy issue. In recent years, there has been a willingness to work with the West in theaters like Afghanistan or on global security issues like the Indo-Pacific. We have also seen a constructive partnership between India and the West on climate change and solar energy, and on questions like the principles of connectivity or respect for international maritime law. Positions of the West and India have been very similar. While Indians look at the future with considerable optimism, they should not forget that the journey ahead has obstacles of history to surmount. Although it made very substantial contributions in the First and Second World War, again, which Lord Bilimoria reminded us, India was not on the high table in 1945 and continues to pay the price for being absent. Underlining its sacrifices in these wars and subsequent peacekeeping operations is part of India's endeavor to make its claims more forcefully. For all the talk of a contemporary world order, it is evident that entrenched powers will not easily yield their privileges, even if that means a more dysfunctional international system. Practices and regimes that derive from 1945 impinge on India negatively, whether it's the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty or the United Nations Security Council representation. As India goes up in the international order, it will advance its own narratives and on occasion even challenge Western ones. This is already happening, whether we look at the history of the British Empire or more contemporary politics. So, there are conversations to be had, adjustments to be made if India and the West are to fashion a more contemporary relationship. The turbulence of our times could actually help us shed old baggage and find new grounds to share. In seeking that, we would do well to recall Lee Kuan Yew's insightful observation that for very good reasons, the world need not be anxious about the rise of India. Thank you.
Now, just while we arrange a little bit of furniture for the panel discussion, we'll play a short film, and then at the end of that, we'll be ready to go into our panel debate.
We've created the University of Birmingham India Institute to celebrate and showcase everything that we do with and in India. We admitted our first students from India in 1909, and over the 100 years since, we've engaged in many, many different ways with many different Indian partners.
Very thankful to Lord Bilimoria, the Chancellor of the University, for his support.
The idea is that all of the great work that we've done to date will be amplified, and we'll also be able to develop new and significant partnerships in India.
We're leading a team of researchers collaborating with groups from India to understand the sources of poor air quality in Delhi and to better provide policy advice to improve the environment in the future.
The university has a very long relationship with India. We have staff working across the board, and that works in sport as well.
We've had a long connection working with India. Prime Minister Modi has set a challenge of doubling farmers' incomes by 2022. We need to find ways to deliver this in a clean and sustainable route.
Anybody who wants to work with the university in India and on Indian issues, on the shared problems that India and the UK face, they'll be able to come to us at the India Institute and work with us.
So let me start by saying thank you for an absolutely fascinating lecture, as billed, as promised, full of insight, full of a lot of wisdom. However, like a true academic, let me start by questioning the question. So the title of your talk was What India Means to the West. Churchill, you reminded us, questioned India's identity. Could I question the West's identity? So given Brexit, given increasing US unilateralism, tensions between the West and East of Europe, increasing polarization within countries, never mind between them, do we need to think of not a single West, but multiple Wests, and how that they relate to India?
Yes, I mean, had I had another half an hour, I would have gone down that avenue. No, I think it's a perfectly valid observation, because what we are seeing is a less unified West, because it's a more nationalistic West. It's not, the US is nationalistic. There are European countries which have been more nationalistic. So even though, in a sense, they've broadly retained a Western sort of identity, they've also asserted their own national identity much sharper. So you're going to get a sort of diversity in the West. There's going to be a spectrum. West will not be a camp. West will now be a spectrum. But even a spectrum has two ends. So it's a finite concept. So I think part of the changing Indian relationship with the West will be to work with a much more diverse West, and sort of find different issues with which you work with different countries, what's important for them. So the world's going to get more complicated, and part of that is this issue.
Well, Bilimoria, Karen, you've been very active in the upper house, speaking about a number of the issues that I've just mentioned. What's your view on that question? Are there multiple Wests, and how do they relate to India in their different ways?
I think firstly, what an excellent speech by Dr. Jaishankar, with the whole spectrum, covering it so clearly in half an hour. So thank you very much for that. And you're absolutely right in that the world is changing drastically. I mean, you have to go back 200 years, and China and India were the biggest, just over 200 years, the biggest economies in the world, and now not only the biggest in population, but China and India will be the biggest economies in the world again. So we've gone full circle. But some of the points that he's made, I think when we say the West, what is the West? I mean, the West is Europe, America, but Australia is also the West. New Zealand is the West at the other end of the world. And I think India's got this wonderful, wonderful advantage of not just being the firewall that you spoke about, which is very important from a security point of view, but India sits uniquely thanks to the 400-year relationship with Britain and the Commonwealth. in that India is at the heart, actually, of being able to link in with the West as well as with Asia, which no other country can. China does not have that advantage that India does. And I think if you look at the way India operates, whether it's the foreign service, whether it's the administrative service, whether it's business, the language of business, it's all very much, the legal system is all very in tune with the West. So I think in that sense, how much the West may change, India will have that huge advantage of dealing with the global economy, including the West. And the Commonwealth, 53 countries, the biggest by far is India. And at the moment, the UK, the total percentage of our trade with all the Commonwealth countries put together, including India, Australia, New Zealand, all 53 countries, is 9% of our trade. So just imagine the potential that we have to increase that.
I'm very pleased to welcome onto the panel Professor Scott Lucas, who's Professor of International Politics. Thanks for joining us, Scott. Your views on the schizophrenia of the West, or the multiple identities of the West, and how they relate to India.
It's great coming from America, being accused of being schizophrenic. So, thanks for the warm welcome. If you forgive me just being a bit ornery, as we say, I've never really believed in a strict binary of India and the West to start off with. And even, if you forgive me, falling back on my historical background, as a Cold War kid, I never believed in the binary of the Cold War, which is like West versus East, or the U.S. versus Soviet Union, and India fit in between. The world's always been more of a kaleidoscope, where you change the patterns, you change the pieces that are there. And so if you think of India under Nehru, for example, this newly independent country with great potential, but thinking about a non-aligned movement, where you didn't fit it into either camp, whether it was working with a country like Yugoslavia, a regional country like Indonesia, for example. Now, that had mixed success, and we can talk about why. I think it has a lot to do with the kaleidoscope inside India, with the challenges it faced economically, socially, politically. But it's also because it was never a clean world with just the West and just the East. Think about India's relations with China, for example, very problematic. Of course, India and Pakistan, just to bring it into a regional focus. What does that have to do with today? I think what's interesting about both the opportunity and the challenge of Indian foreign policy is that you don't necessarily look at the West even as you use it as a unit of analysis that the ambassador talks about. So you look at a United States whose own position versus other countries is under a state of tension, to say the least, and how do you navigate that? You look at a UK, which is such an important partner, but is it a UK which is within Europe or outside of Europe, and you have to factor that in. And you look at those countries that I think, the ambassador focused on the West, but we bring them in there, and that is, India sees an opportunity with Iran, or has seen an opportunity with Iran. Massive port project at Chabahar in southern Iran. Can it pursue that, given the animosity of the U.S. at this point? Or you look at India, for example, with China declaring the Silk Road Initiative. And where does India, given, let's say, a mixed relationship with China in the past, but seeing great opportunities there, where does it pursue that opportunity with China, even when you have some Western countries, the U.S., who have decided that they want to be confrontational? So India has this unique geographical position, but where does it sit within the kaleidoscope where globalization, that's just a simple get-out clause. It's way too complicated than that.
Scott, thank you. And to introduce our final member of the panel, Dr Aman Puri, Consul General of India in Birmingham. I know he's known to many of you in this room. And Aman, thank you so much for the partnership with the consulate, and particularly for this evening. Do you have any thoughts that you want to share on that particular issue?
I'd just like to add that, when we look at these constructs, whether it is India or the West, I think we need to remember that while the constructs will help us understand the world, but we need to always remember that they're not going to be like a homogeneous kind of construct. So it's always going to have a lot of diversity within.
Very good, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question as chair, and then it will be your turn. So please do start thinking about your questions, because I've just got one more, and then I'll be handing it over to the floor. And again, actually, it's following on from something that Scott touched on, which is that much of your lecture, Ambassador, touched on India, the West, and East Asia, especially China. Now, in between India and the West is West Asia, or the Middle East, as some of us refer to it. Very important for India. About 60% of Indian oil imports, and even more of its natural gas, comes from there. This is particularly at the front of my mind because this afternoon we hosted the Israeli ambassador to the UK, Mark Regev, who actually unprompted mentioned the growing ties between Israel and India, as well as Israel and the UK. And obviously, it's very much in the news, developments there, very fluid, perhaps difficult to see all the way through to the end of that. But does that region of the world, which you mentioned a little bit but didn't dive into depth, do the interests of, I'll narrow the West down to the UK for this evening's purpose, the interests of UK and India coincide there? And where do you see that situation going and those interests evolving?
Well, I actually, in my remarks, made 2 points which are relevant to it. One, that if you see the 2 regions of the world which the West misread and therefore caused trouble to itself, one was West Asia and one was East Asia. These are the 2 strategic misreadings. I'd say misreading. Now, in terms of, I would also then suggest that these are exactly the 2 regions where there is actually convergence of interest between the West loosely and India. Now, if I were to take West Asia, I'm just giving you the example of the Gulf. There are today about 7 million plus Indians living in the Gulf. 7 million. Okay. If we are among the major oil importers of the world, we'd be among the top 5 in terms of, say, Iran today we are number 2. For a number of other countries we'd be 2, 3, 4, not less than that. If you look at the sort of the contribution that we make, I'm not even talking security here, I'm talking basic stability here. The presence of India in different ways is key to the stability of this region. So I think it is an area where there are actually intersecting UK or Western interests with India in that entire region. And if you were to look at it sort of in terms of broad outlook again, the fact that we are democratic, the fact we are multi-faith, the fact that there's a sort of pluralism which we associate with the word West in a way. I think all of that is also a lesson to this region. So I think there's a message just by doing our own thing, we are sending a message to that part of the world. In a different way, we are doing that with East Asia as well, because if you look at now what brings us closer, India and the West vis-a-vis East Asia, market economy, rule of law, contracts, following international conventions, making decisions which are consultative. These are our common points, and these have not always been respected in that particular region. So I do think that there is a larger lesson here, and the reason why I picked the construct of the West, there were 2. One, look, you need a construct to make people think. If I were to give you an example of 25 countries, by the time I finish the list, your eyes would sort of glaze over. I think we need that a sharp idea to say, okay, this is the West stands for something, the West used to work in a united manner, maybe it's less united now. But again, the other reason I did that, and I said if I was giving a talk in India, I'd give it a little differently. There's a lot of talk in Asia today that, the time of Asia has come, which is not wrong. that we are rising in the world and the balance is shifting, which is also true. But while Asian economies quantitatively would be large in the next 20, 30 years, if you look at the quality of the economy, look at technology, look at innovation, look at where other ideas for changing the world are going to come from, I think the West in many ways is kind of feeling a bit down. Okay, it's underselling itself in the world because it's going through a period of internal churning. And I think it's important for the rest of us not to, the West may have made its mistakes, but we shouldn't make a mistake about the West. We should read the West right. And the fact is that if you look at what's going to change the world, a lot of that's still going to come out of the West.
Of course. Quickly add to that. Firstly, of course, the University of Birmingham has opened up our campus in Dubai. Again, the first Russell Group university to open up in Dubai, with a plan very soon to have a large campus being purpose-built as well. And our first students start this coming up academic year, and Robin's been
already studying with us. Yeah.
So that's great news. But I think two things. I spoke in a debate last week in the House of Lords on religious intolerance and prejudice here in the UK. And of course, there have been great concerns about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And the point that I did make there in that debate was that if you look at pluralism, India is the most pluralist country in the world by far. Every single religion that you can imagine coexisting for centuries. And it's just phenomenal. I just helped launch a book yesterday that was presented to me in the House of Lords about how India prays. And you see that book, and you see the different, and Hinduism is one big global term, but within Hinduism, the way, and then the Buddhists, and the Parsis, and the Muslims, and the Jewish communities, and it is just remarkable where India is a great world to the world of a pluralist society. And then the other aspect of what the ambassador was talking about is I chaired 10 years ago the first meeting in Israel of the UK-Israel Chamber of Commerce and the Israel-India Chamber of Commerce, and put them together and had a joint meeting. And the amount of technology partnership that goes on between India and Israel is growing and phenomenal. And I spoke in a debate yesterday on the future of life sciences in the UK in the context of Brexit. And if you look at R&D expenditure, we spend 1.7% of GDP on R&D, and research and development innovation. And we're less than 1% of the world's population. We produce 16% of the world's highest rated research papers. So we do pretty well. The OECD average is 2.4%, which is the government's target to get to in the short term. Israel's spending on R&D and innovation is 4.5% of GDP, 3 times what we spend. So there's huge opportunity there, both for India and the UK.
If it's all right, Scott, I'm now, time is marching on it. The clock is always our enemy, isn't it? And I would like to open up to questions from the floor, if that's all right. So we have, the lights are gently rising. We have roving microphones. That gentleman there was exceedingly quick in getting his hand up, so well done. What I'd ask you to do is, if you could briefly introduce yourself, your name, your affiliation, and then short, punchy questions. Thank you.
Ashley Jelliman, I work in the telecom sector. And interestingly, Ambassador, firstly, thank you. An excellent and very thought-provoking presentation. I've had the pleasure of working in your country, in India, on a number of occasions. And in the telecom sector at the moment, the Chinese, who you've mentioned a number of times, seem to have a significant presence in manufacturing, especially a couple of companies. Is that a market that India should be getting into? Because it seems not to be there at the moment.
Thank you. Yeah.
No, meaning India should be getting into the Chinese market, or that?
Into the manufacturing of telecoms equipment. There's 2 large Chinese organisations, Huawei and ZTE, who I won't say have cornered the market, but they have a significant market share. And it feels like that, given the innovations that India does in other things, is something that you've missed. I don't know.
Yes, that's true. And in fact, I observed that when I was ambassador to China. Those were the years where actually companies like Huawei and ZTE made debut. I think what is visible more now are actually the instruments themselves. We've just had Samsung actually move one of its global production facilities to India. I think what you would see in the coming years is probably, including in telecom, global manufacturers use India as a production hub. I see that happening. Now, whether Indian companies themselves would invest in it, I can only speak for my own. And that's not a business right now we are doing.
But India would then be following the pattern that, say, China went through in terms of, developing a manufacturing base. You've got huge numbers of workers coming into the labour market over the next 10 years, 1 million workers a month.
I mean, this is a big debate, okay? I don't think the idea that somehow India can replicate in substantial measure what China did, I think it's a fundamentally flawed argument. I think that moment in history is gone. China is different. Global demands are different. China allowed global companies to come into China in terms which I don't think the Indian economy or the Indian politics will allow. Because I think a lot of global companies were given carve-outs and terms which were different from the Chinese domestic producer. But China could do that because China really ran a dual economy. China ran an economy where it provided location for global manufacturers, but China ran a different economy for its own market and then used that, the osmosis between them very effectively. So I would question this idea that somehow India would be sort of the next China. I think India will have to be very different. Again, we have a very fundamental disadvantage, which is our infrastructure is nowhere as efficient as China's is. And today, when you look at manufacturing, logistics is your paramount concern in making a choice. So I think India will have to devise its own answers. I don't think India can have a China answer to its future.
Very good. I'm going to go next to that gentleman there, and then I can see another hand there, just so that we can get...
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for an amazing lecture. I'm a clinical professor at university down the road, Vice-Chancellor. But my question is this. You've talked a lot about economic development, and I really do think we need economic development if we're going to sort out the health problems globally, never mind anything else. But have we put the cart before the horse? Is there anything else that humanity should be chasing? And as India, as 1/6 of humanity, could probably lead by example. And then another quick comment is that we forget that we are tied with the West. Well, I am Western, but India and the East is tied with the West through its languages and its numbers. So there's a lot of other things that we should be looking at besides economic growth, which is absolutely essential and a bedrock. Don't get me wrong.
You want to take multiple questions? It may be easier.
I think so. So we've got that one in the bank, and I'm going to combine a few questions so that we can bring a few more people in. So I think I saw one there. Just so that I don't favour that bit too much, there's a lady just down there in the middle as well, please. So let's have your question, please.
Thank you, Dr. Jaishankar. I am just a member of the public. I'm an eye surgeon, in fact, far removed from international relations. But I've got a comment to make and also a question for you. The comment is, you have alluded to 2 strategic misreadings by the West. Can I say that a third one could have been when the West saw the demise of the Soviet Union, and there was a bit of bonhomie initially in the mid-90s, which then changed to a condescending attitude by the West, which ultimately led to a very nationalistic attitude by Russia. So at that time, if the West had helped with a Marshall Plan kind of thing, then Russia could have been very different today. That's the comment. And the question to you, India is trying to do the fine rope walking between Russia and the West. And at present, Russia is not at all on good terms with the West. To what extent do you see India capable of doing this balancing act and trying to get the best for itself. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. And I'm going to take a third question and then we'll respond.
I'm Sudha Sundar. I'm Professor of Gynecological Cancer at the University of Birmingham and an Indian graduate. You alluded to economic determinism not translating into international influence or power, that we'd lost out in 1945 and have lost out on different occasions since. How does India make that leap from being the top 6 economy and rising into being an international power, and how can the diaspora help in that?
Very good. Okay, so we've got 3 questions. We're going to pause. I promise I'll bring some more people in. So, paraphrasing the first question, if you don't mind, there's the question of, should it be about growth and development or about another set of values? That sort of aligns somewhat with Sudha's question about how will India make the leap to become an economic and a political power commensurate with its size and scale. And then a slightly different question, but still an interesting one, I think, which is, especially given mistakes made in the past, what is the best way to approach Russia? So, would you like to start, and then we'll bring in the rest of them?
I mean, in a sense, I think these 2 questions are linked. One is more internal, one is a little more external. Look, in terms of what's happening in India, what should happen in India, I've lived as a large part of my recent life in East Asia. Okay, I lived 5 years in Japan, 4.5 years in China, almost 3 years in Singapore. And while, yes, first of all, growth is underestimated. When you actually grow, just by growing, you have no idea how many problems you solve by simply growing. So at one level, we should have a India is at a stage where there should be very strong commitment to growth, because if you get too distracted, you say, okay, I've got multiple targets, I'm growing, but there's not enough income distribution, social justice also needs to be served. You take your eyes off that growth ball, you're in trouble. You could at some point, but definitely not now, because if I were to, again, give you a China analogy, even though I say China is not always an analogy, you look at India's per capita income level today. Okay, this is roughly where China would be around 2005, 2006. And 2006, China was still firing all cylinders on growth. It was heading for the 2008-9 problem. But my sense is, at one level, you've got to keep that growth going. But actually is a sense of what should be changing in society. And here, the Chinese addressed a lot of these problems before we did. We've actually addressed the political challenges much earlier in the game. I think the Chinese were much more successful in attacking the social challenges. And if you look at some of the things which have happened in India the last 4 years, the word reform, the term reform actually came out of balance of payments crisis in 91-92. Now, people always thought initially, certainly in public policy, reform much more in economic terms. I think today that concept of reform has become much more social. If you don't do something about gender balance, if you don't do things about skills, so you look at these national campaigns today about cleanliness, about girls' education, about Startup India, Skills India. I think this is a very good thing. Now we can argue whether it's been done well enough, could we have done it faster, bigger, deeper, all of that very legitimate. But at least I think with having the right conversations, there's the right agenda coming out there, which is you need a much deeper sort of sense of what is good for the country. So again, it's a sort of slightly contradictory answer. I would still keep the eye on the growth, but I would also somehow move my hands around and do the rest of it. I think just by pursuing growth alone, you would not deal with, you look at women in workplace statistics in India. I mean, it's terrible. And the prospects are pretty bleak, because as it is, there's a skills problem. And in the case of women, there's a literacy issue and an education issue as well. On the what can we do, in terms of, my point was there is today suddenly in Asia a sense Asia is rising economically, and therefore automatically Asia will rise politically, or Asia will rise in influence. I would challenge that. Because I think the world's a much more complicated place. You could get, again, raw numbers. Asian economies could be big, but definitely if you would look at, as I said, innovation, technology, these are still very much coming out of Europe. I mean, even a China-Europe relationship today, other than quantitatively, is still very skewed in favor of Europe. It's the Chinese who come to Europe for technology. It's not Europe which goes to China. So here, my sense of it would be that India needs to be very self-critical, be very aware of what it has achieved, but what it hasn't. It needs to work with the West to see what are the strong points of the West. In some ways, because we are a Western, an Asian society, but a Western Asian society, I use the term very loosely, I think we have the unique ability to actually get the best, bridge that. Here, the diaspora, the people of Indian origin, would be immensely helpful, because their role in actually bridging geographies. Today, when we look at the US or UK, for us, it's almost a continuum, and that spectrum is smooth because I think there is that bridge. It certainly, in working together, in doing business, in universities, my sense is it would have great value. But I would also argue, there's a slightly different debate, which is if India is to step forward and kind of create its own brand as a power, I think India should be, yes, it would be nationalistic, but a kind of a generous nationalism, not a sort of a narrow nationalism. And I think that would be part of its bridging USP. On the Russia question, absolutely I agree with you, which is, I think a lot of problems that you're having with Russia is a feeling in Russia. It was my first posting. I've been there from time to time. Russia feels badly treated by the West. It feels it made a lot of changes after 92, and these, instead of being recognized for it, it was taken advantage of. You could disagree with that, but certainly that's a perception in Russia. And I think a lot of Russian positions today are coming out of that. And I would, in my revised version of this lecture, I would include that as a third strategic misreading.
Karen, actually specifically on Russia, but also the first issue, if you want, what your thoughts on that?
First issue, I think it's a very good question, and I think the key to it is it's not just growth, but it needs to be inclusive growth. And that's, to me, whether you apply it to here, to the UK, or whether it's to India in particular, it's inclusive growth that matters. And I look back to when I started the UK-India Business Council and the BJP government at that time that was in power, the growth rates were almost touching 10%. India was flying economically, and yet they lost the elections. And the reason was the India Shining government lost because they weren't including everyone, and particularly the rural areas, in the growth. This time round, I think the government is far more aware of that, and inclusive growth is really crucial. So I think that's a good point that you made. On Russia, it used to be such a simple thing with India in the past. India was socialist before it liberalized, so it aligned with Russia and Pakistan and America. So all the military equipment for Pakistan came from America, and all the military equipment for India came from Russia. Things have changed so much now. India is much more globally looking, much more outward looking, but it is a balancing act. And I think Russia itself, people forget this. We're a bigger economy than Russia, the UK. India is a bigger economy than Russia, and Russia is a phenomenal country to anyone who's been there. Over 120 million people, huge, and the double-headed eagle looking east and west geographically. I mean, it's just phenomenal potential, but we often forget, and yet it's got so much influence in the world. And the last point about the diaspora, I think it is such a powerful, the Indian diaspora, 30 million strong around the world. And who knows, the first woman president of the US may be Nikki Haley, an Indian.
You stole the question that I was going to put to Scott, actually, which is Russia east or west?
Russia's Vladimir Putin right now. I mean, all right, let's try to walk a tightrope between the questions about market economies and development and how we solve international conflict. You know, I don't like divisions, so I'm going to use that to link those two issues that come about. And the first point is, and this is just my personal standpoint, on the economic development question, it shouldn't be a choice between economic development and social issues, environmental issues. In fact, they should be linked. You know, the problem with a market economy, especially the way it was taught to me way back in the Milton Friedman era in the States, for those folks who know that economist is, a market economy just takes what you have. It just takes what you have. But you all probably know out there that what an economy really requires is it requires social investment. And it requires investment in communities, and it requires investment in infrastructure, and you don't immediately make a profit off of that. So you've got to talk about your health services. You've got to talk about transport networks. You've got to talk about protecting the environment. Otherwise, your market economy is going to give you a false boom, which I think India found out a bit of, and which the Chinese definitely found out. You think about the pollution problems in Beijing, which I think the ambassador knows about, having been there. That China is having to reconsider that notion of uninhibited growth. So that's my starting point. And if you look at some of the cooperative projects that we're talking about there, right, when we talk about in transport or talk about in terms of cancer research, that's what makes this relationship so vital between our university and Indian partners, is that you're not making a false choice. And I think in the same way, when you look at the international community around India, and I'm going to bring the Middle East back into this, watch this, right? Is that so much of what is set up in international politics has been that notion of confrontation, where areas become playgrounds. And so the Middle East, and fundamentalism is part of the problem in the Middle East, but part of the problem has been that it became a playground for other powers to go in, whether you're talking about the Israel-Palestine issue, whether you're talking about Egypt versus Iraq, or whether you're talking about Iran versus Iraq. Well, India's got a choice now when it comes into those great power confrontations, or those power confrontations, whether it's the U.S. versus Russia or others, which is, does it just become another kid in the playground, or does it actually look for a different way forward? And I think that gives me a second outlook, which interests me about India, both vis-a-vis the U.S. and Russia, or Soviet Union, as it was then, and the Middle East. You know, 1947 is this huge change. You know, we're going to get Indian independence, but Britain's going to give up the mandate for Palestine with all that ensues off of that. And indeed, of course, Sri Lanka, you know, comes out of that moment where all these areas have their futures which are ahead of them. But for 70 years, we've seen conflict, we've seen turmoil. Why do I say India has a part to play? India has had issues of fundamentalism, which it has dealt with. It has had to deal with, my understanding, the sectarian versus the democratic, or versus the inclusive. India is a country which from its earliest days has had to deal with issues of displacement and refugees, and how you rebuild out of that. Well, what is it exactly we're seeing in the Middle East right now? Strip away the playground and all the great powers. These are countries which not only need some type of peacekeeping, another area in which India has had interest, but they're going to need rehabilitation. They're going to need dealing with the issues of displaced people, and they're going to need another way forward than what we've had from the international community, quite often with regret, over the past 70 years. So India's got that choice. Got the choice of market economy, imbalance internally with other social issues, but it's got that choice as a rising power, which is, does it simply fit into the way that we have done things before, including with regret the West, or does it look for a different way forward on humanitarian, social, and economic issues?
Thank you. Time is really marching on, but I'm, with your permission, audience, please do, if you do need to go, we understand. But I'd like to fit in 3 more questions. The deal will be the questions are going to be very short, and the deal on the stage will be the answers also will be nice and punchy. I'm a professor of economics, so I'm doing ever so well to keep my views to myself about all of that market economy stuff. So the one down the front here, please. One over there, and it's a dead draw between you, but the chap on the second row, if that's okay. So one just on the left. So please do go ahead.
Sunil Poshakwale, Professor of International Finance, Cranfield School of Management, Cranfield University. A pleasure to be here. Thank you for the wonderful lecture, Ambassador. I want to ask a specific question. To what extent India's geopolitical issues, particularly issues related to cross-border terrorism, etc., has affected India's relations with the United Kingdom in particular and the West in general? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Second question, please.
Hello. Very happy to be here and just be a part of audience in this wonderful lecture. So I'm Manish Rana. I just come to UK. I'm studying sports science over here. So my question is a little different from all of the other questions. It's regarding sports. Yeah. So I just want to ask, in what gravity means UK look to help India? Means in sports. Just you mentioned that UK universities are helping our Indian athletes. So, like in 2004, UK were distant 10th in Olympic medal tally, just winning 9 gold medals. And now in Rio Olympics, they beat China. They won 27 gold medals. So, I just want to know, can India look up to UK for the sports science researches and all? Like, how can they help, really help?
Very good, thank you. And the third question.
My name is Shubhansh. I'm a second-year undergrad studying economics at UOB. My question is to Ambassador. What was the most tricky situation you've been in your whole history, and how did you learn from it, and how did you work towards solving it?
So that will be a test of diplomatic skills. So we've got 3 questions there. So how have geopolitics affected the relationship between India and the UK? How does engagement in sport help to connect the UK, and how can the UK and India, and how can the UK help India? The Commonwealth Games being held here in Birmingham must surely be part of that. And what's the trickiest situation you faced? Would you like to start with the last question first?
No, actually, I'll start with the first one. Look, I think the issue of terrorism used to be a more divisive issue in the past. And with the UK specifically, with the West generally. My sense is it's changing. I think there's a much greater recognition today in the West, in UK, in India, that we are, the bad guys are common bad guys and we really need to work together. So I think it's much less of a divisive issue now than it used to be. But there are some geographies where we do sometimes we're not on the same page. I think Afghanistan would be an obvious case. On the issue of sports, look, I'm tempted to give you the answer that the one place which, one way the UK could help us in sports is to make us play better in English conditions in cricket. But seriously, I would tell you, there's a particular sport I'm very interested in. I know much less than I do of cricket, and that's actually soccer, football. I feel that it's possible to grow sports, to grow, a completely new business or a new activity out there, and the established players here, established teams here can make a big difference. And we ourselves, I'm talking Tatas here, we have a football team, we work with European football teams out here. I know that that's beginning to make a difference. So My sense is sports is an area we don't think of it as sort of international cooperation as much as we should. Maybe we need to make it a little more business friendly for that to happen, but I definitely see a future out there. I don't know very much. I'm not sure I'd have the same answer for the Olympic sports. The tricky one is actually a tricky question, because I can think of different situations, some funny, some not so funny. I'd give you a not so funny one, which actually happened to me, which was fairly early in my career. I got pulled into office because I came in early, and I was working on a hijacking. And midway through I had a little kid, okay, and my wife and I, we used to both go to work, so somebody had to feed the kid, and I used to do that afternoon job. I rang up my mother and said, there's a hijacking, and I can't come back home. And in the course of my conversation with my mother, I discovered that my dad was actually on that plane. So I had worked half a day on that hijacking till I made that discovery. And as you can imagine, it was tricky. So you can, in life end up with some odd situations. Sometimes you can end up with very funny situations.
Would others like to... Amin, would you perhaps like to say, preparations for the Commonwealth Games being held in Birmingham in 2022?
Yeah, but in fact, I had a separate, kind of a point to what Ambassador Jaishankar mentioned about keeping the ball on the economic growth and also doing the other things. Just wanted to mention that the Government of India, as most of you would be aware, is actually in the process of implementing the world's largest healthcare insurance scheme to cover 500 million individuals. So that is something which, is being done, and the biggest criticism, or let's say the question mark, is what people are asking, where do you get the money from? So the bottom line is that you need to have the economic growth to be able to do these kind of measures which will impact the life and welfare of your people.
Very good. Looking to anything that you wish to add or subtract?
I'll follow you. All right. You don't let me follow. You're going to have to rescue me here.
Nice and short, though.
Oh, yeah. Well, I do waffle on a bit, but we'll keep it tight here, right? Look, the geopolitical question is a great one, but I come back to, I guess, maybe choices that India faces which sort of transcend that idea that we put the world in terms of the war on terror. And that is, for example, Afghanistan is not going to be a country for the foreseeable future. It's going to be a fragmented set of small, basically mini countries, if you want to put it that way. That's not going to resolve itself. And so the effects of that, the effects for a Pakistan, for example, the effects for an India, is how do you respond to that? And the question for me as an outsider and trying to learn as a student is how India navigates that Afghanistan question with respect to a question such as a Kashmir, or with respect in terms of its relations with Pakistan, with the region. And similarly, to echo the fact, is that I grew up for decades in the idea it was always Moscow or it was Washington. There have been countries for decades that have said you don't make that false choice, you have to move within it. And that's where India is now for me, in terms of multiple choices which it has to make. In terms of how we can cooperate in sport to make things better, well, it's a double-edged sword, because if climate change keeps going the way it's going right now, you're going to have better pitches for Indian cricket within the next few years. But of course, the downside of that is the effects that all of us suffer. And you've just heard of the fact that India is so well positioned in terms of where it stands with this large economy, in terms of that climate change question, even as other countries we can mention, the United States is retreating from it. In sport, I started off as a sports journalist. Love sports. And the one thing I would say that's been even more impressive than the Olympics over here that I wish we could share between countries is something called parkrun. A parkrun doesn't mean gold medals. It doesn't mean that every 4 years. But about hundreds of thousands of people here from communities going out and running together on a Saturday morning. And the benefits that has brought me individually, but many others I know. And that spirit of sport as a community behavior, a behavior that we all cooperate with, as well as sometimes having competition, that's where I hope we share ideas, as well as just the basics like sports science in helping people out with that.
Great, thanks, Scott. I'm going to give Karen the final word, if I may.
I think one of the most important things that Ambassador Jaishankar said in his speech was that where India and the UK are concerned, India hasn't just looked at the UK as a gateway to Europe, but also a gateway to the world. And that is how important the UK is. And that's where the uncertainty over Brexit, we'll have to wait to see what happens over the next 4 months about what's going to happen there. But that's a crucial point. And with regard to sport, we over here, we are one of the highest rated universities in sports science. We've just opened a brand new £55 million sports centre. Princess Anne came to open the sports centre for us earlier this year. We're going to be hosting a lot of the Commonwealth Games. And I always say this little country, 1% of the world's population, and we came second in the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games. I mean, I think it's absolutely incredible what we achieve over here. And we're working with India, we're working with the Sports Authority of India to work together. Because if China can win all those gold medals, India can win even more. And one of my great disappointments in life is one of the greatest cricketers ever, if not the greatest cricketer ever, Sachin Tendulkar, never made a century at Lord's.
We could go on, but we mustn't because time is against us. So let me now invite Dr Aman Puri to give a vote of thanks. Aman.
It is my privilege today to say a very big thank you to each and every one of you, all of you who have come from different cities to join us on this very special evening. I hope you had a wonderful time and you enjoyed the lecture and the interaction as much as I did. I would also like to say a very special word of thanks and offer my sincere gratitude to our chief guest, Ambassador Jaishankar, who agreed to come all the way from India and deliver this inaugural lecture organized jointly by the India Institute of the University of Birmingham and the Consul General of India, Birmingham. Sir, your august presence here has enhanced the profile of the lecture series and actually has set a very high benchmark for the future. Thanks also to Ms. Kyoko Jaishankar for gracing this occasion. I would like to extend my regards to Chancellor Karan Bilimoria, who has been the driving force in the setting up of the India Institute, and also for his enormous contributions to strengthening the relationship between UK and India. Sincere thanks are also in order to Vice-Chancellor of the University of Birmingham, Professor Sir David Eastwood, for his support to various collaborative initiatives of the university with counterpart institutions in India. Professor Scott Lucas also deserves his share of thanks for participating in the panel and sharing his invaluable insights on international affairs with us. And my thanks and gratitude goes to Professor Robin Mason, Pro-Vice-Chancellor International and Director, India Institute, for his dynamism to promote the Institute in various ways. Due to his visionary leadership of the Institute, activities between the university and India have grown exponentially since the launch this January. My compliments to the artists for the cultural program and to Ms. Piali Ray for curating the most wonderful show. I couldn't leave the podium today without mentioning the unstinted help and support of the two most wonderful ladies who have actually put in their heart and soul to make this evening happen. May I thank Ms. Wenwei Wu and Ms. Shruti Doshi. Finally, I'd like to make a special mention of our Consulate General team who've actually contributed tremendously in the success of this event. Hope all of you have a wonderful rest of the evening. Thank you so much.